Next I want to do another brief test, and this is to see how your memory works during a period of learning. I'm going to read a list of words, and I want you to try to
Welcome, this is the VO2 Lounge, episode 63 on creatine, but more specifically, the common questions and misconceptions about creatine supplementation. Now, creatine is a very popular supplement among athletes and people who work out in general because it helps build muscle, boost performance, and speed up the recovery process. Now, research also shows that creatine can have a lot of benefits for older adults and people with certain health conditions. Now, studies suggest that taking creatine in the recommended amounts, about 3 to 5 grams per day, is generally a safe practice. Now, even with 500 plus studies on creatine, some common questions about its effectiveness and safety still pop up incredibly frequently. Now, here are some of the examples of questions and the questions that we're going to go over in this episode. So, does creatine cause water retention? Is creatine the same as an anabolic steroid? Can creatine harm your kidneys? Does creatine cause hair loss or baldness? Can creatine cause dehydration or muscle cramps? Is creatine unsafe for kids or teens? Does creatine make you gain fat? Do you need to load creatine, as in take a large amount for the first 10 days, let's say? Is creatine helpful for older adults? Is creatine only useful for strength or power sports? Is creatine only effective for men? And are other types of creatine better than creatine monohydrate? And does it stay stable in liquids? Now, my partner has recently started taking creatine as part of her newfound interest in the gym, or the Church of Iron, as I like to call it. And we literally almost went through all these questions. There was a lot of, not skepticism, but concern about this white powder that you're taking and what its effects are, what are the downsides, how should you take it. And like everyone gets obsessed with these things and wants to maximize the benefit of the substance, but also while being concerned as to whether there's going to be any adverse health effects. Now, my main source for synthesizing this information is a paper titled Common Questions and Misconceptions about Creatine Supplementation. What does the scientific evidence really show? Which I've linked down below. And it was the paper that literally, when trying to describe to her why creatine is, okay to take and what the benefits are, whether there's any value in loading it, I was like, let's go to PubMed. Let's just find a paper. There happens to be one. It synthesized all the information we really needed. Had voiced some of the concerns I had about various different studies saying various different things, not very repeatable, and causing this misbelief that once the study makes its way into, say, for example, YouTube or podcasts, where someone takes the opinion of the study / the findings of the study and runs with it, and then it becomes this systemic disbelief or misbelief about the substance. It was a great bedrock for then a podcast episode, which is what I'm doing now. Now, I don't think I've ever dedicated an episode specifically to creatine, but I have definitely summarized it in many of my previous episodes. It's something I am so familiar with, having been around health, fitness, sports, that kind of stuff for so long, that I take it for granted that it's novelty for some people. So let's get a high level overview to get everyone up to speed who maybe is most likely coming across this episode because they have heard of creatine and want to know whether they should be taking it. So what is creatine? Creatine is naturally produced in the liver, kidneys, and pancreas, about 1 gram per day. The rest comes from the diet that we have, mostly from amino acids like arginine, methionine, and glycine. Now, creatine helps muscles produce energy, especially during short bursts of intense activity, like strength training, for example. It does this by storing energy in the form of phosphocreatine, which helps make ATP the main energy currency or source for our cells. Now, muscles can store enough ATP and phosphocreatine for about 10 seconds of high intensity activity, say a sprint or a set in the gym of deadlifts or bench press or whatever it is. Now, taking creatine supplements can increase total creatine in the muscles by 10 or even 30%. There's very much an individual variation like there is with response to exercise in general. Now, there's no one-size-fits-all recommendation. I say this very loosely because there to some extent is. The paper suggests there's no one-size-fits-all recommendation for how much creatine to take, but in general, studies show it helps with building lean muscle and improving athletic performance, especially in short, intense activities. Now, a typical maintenance dose is around 0.03 grams per kilogram of body weight per day for about 4 to 6 weeks, but some use creatine for up to 10 weeks. Now, commercial creatine supplements often suggest 4 to 5 grams per day, but the dosage and frequency instructions can be vague to some extent, and since these products aren't regulated by the FDA when it comes to America in particular, their content may vary or include unwanted ingredients. Now, this is supplements in general. Creatine isn't novel in that way. Supplements, it's one of my things against novel supplements, say like CBD and the likes, where the control over the actual dosage in them or whether the active ingredients in there in any reasonable amount is unregulated. And the no one size fits all and the 0.03 grams per kilogram, generally it's just accepted that you just take it perpetually unless there's some reason you want to cycle off it. And just take the 5 grams per day. The weighing it out adds extra nonsense to the equation, and really the 5 grams per day is industry-wise the standard you'll see everywhere. Now, a loading phase is sometimes used, which we will cover as to whether it's necessary, to quickly boost creatine stores, typically taking 20 to 25 grams per day for 5 to 7 days. However, you can still increase creatine levels without this loading phase. It just simply takes longer to saturate the system. Now, different recommendations exist, but the International Society of Sports Nutrition supports a loading dose of 0.3 grams per kilogram of body weight for at least 3 days. Let's get into the questions. The first one being, does creatine lead to water retention? So there's a common myth that creatine causes long-term water retention, likely based on the early studies showing water retention after taking 20 grams of creatine per day for 6 days. While short-term creatine use can increase water in the body, especially in the first few days, this doesn't seem to last over time. Now, creatine is absorbed into the muscles with the help of sodium, which can draw water into the cells. However, this process doesn't significantly affect water retention long term. Several studies lasting between 5 and 10 weeks found that people who took creatine didn't experience any noticeable changes in body total water. Now, whether inside or outside the cells, this wasn't the case. So, for example, resistance-trained men who followed creatine regimes showed no significant water retention, and this was the case for both men and women over several weeks. One study did find an increase in total body water after 8 weeks of creatine use, but it was tied to muscle growth, which is normal as intracellular water helps build muscle. So while creatine might cause a slight increase in water weight in the short term, most evidence suggests it doesn't lead to long-term water retention, especially when considering muscle growth. I don't know why. Okay, so for me personally, as someone who currently main sport is cycling, the fear of water retention is associated with the increase of mass and therefore a reduction in total watts per kilo, which is one of the performance metrics associated with cycling performance. Now, where I think this stems from, because most people going to the gym, lifting weights, taking creatine, and being worried about water retention are not cyclists. I can guarantee you that. So where does this myth or fear, more importantly, let's start with the fear. The fear, I can only assume, comes from the fact that potentially bodybuilders actually stepping on stage want to reduce water retention because they want to look lean and look good on stage and win a competition. Whereas in individual training, the nth degree of water retention doesn't matter. Really, the end goal is probably some aesthetics, mainly health, and maybe some satisfaction from lifting heavier weights, whatever the thing is. But that nth degree of water retention probably not really going to affect you. And if you really are bothered, I guess cycle off it when you're going to, your beach holiday or something and you want to look at your most lean or something, or just you're doing a fake competition prep just because you want something to do. But in other people, and women in particular, I think, talking to them, fear this water retention. But by the looks of things, I personally was still under the impression that there was an element of it from historic anecdotal stuff that I did on myself. With this, and then the further reading I did on the side to go with this, I now am curious myself and potentially will attempt to see if there is any water retention, and potentially cycle on it at a point where I know I'm not increasing muscle mass in any particular large amount, and see if there is any fluctuation in mass. But will I do that? It's questionable. Likelihood is I'm just going to cycle onto it during the off season and potentially just keep it through the whole season if my weight looks acceptable. Because even if it magically is a kilo, really, at 87 kilos, the difference between 87 and 88, it doesn't really matter for most of the racing I do. So, yeah, it's potentially going to get reintroduced, given it's so cheap, along with some other supplements that I'm looking into to see what kind of concoction, for lack of a better word, I want to run going into the next season. So then the next one, which is less frequent, however, I definitely think from an older generation looking down, if you're like in your teens, say you live at home and then you order this creatine, this white powder to your house, and you recently started going to the gym a lot, especially when I was in my teens and I had friends whose parents were very skeptical or very hands-on / controlling to some extent, is creatine an anabolic steroid was definitely at the forefront of some people's concern. So on the anabolic steroid topic, anabolic steroids, right, are synthetic versions of testosterone, a hormone naturally produced in both men and women. Now, it's used to boost muscle mass and strength by increasing muscle protein synthesis directly. Now, steroids work by entering muscle cells, binding to receptors, and activating genes that promote muscle growth. Now, creatine, on the other hand, helps produce energy, ATP, in muscles, which can improve performance during high-intensity exercise and indirectly support muscle growth over time. That's the key factor. There, in a episode I did a while back, maybe like episode 50 or something, I did an episode talking about why steroids are essentially amazing, like incredible, in a sense that not advocating for their use, but looking through papers. There's a famous paper where a group of individuals were given steroids, right? And some were steroids and training, some were training no steroids, some were sedentary, and some were sedentary with steroids. And the group that had steroids and were sedentary gained more muscle mass than the group who were exercising, resistance training, naturally, right? Now, whether it's always going to be that level of magnitude, whether there's some outliers, but the fact is that if you gave creatine to a group of people who were not exercising, you would not see them put on more muscle mass than the non-exercising group, essentially. It's physically signaling an anabolic steroid that your body can support more muscle mass, essentially, whereas creatine is a bit like caffeine in the sense that if you're doing an interval, if you're a cyclist or you're doing weights in the gym, think of going to the gym and you go to the gym at 5 a.m. and you've had nothing to eat and you've had no caffeine versus you've had some sugar and you've had some caffeine. the difference in the workout. Now, if the aliens were to come down from space and see this effect, they, in isolation, they may go, and just have the results. They would be like, clearly sugar and caffeine improve muscle growth. What they're not recognizing is the fact that, no, if you now can see the volume and number of sets and the intensity and all these other factors, clearly it's just that the individuals are now training harder. They are getting through more volume, they're getting through more intensity, and therefore have an increase in total muscle mass, unlike the steroids that are just simply signaling more mass to be produced. Now, while both steroids and creatine can lead to muscle gains, they, as I've said, work differently. And anabolic steroids are classified as drugs, are illegal without prescription, and are controlled substances regulated by, in the US in particular, the FDA. Now, creatine is a legal dietary supplement regulated under different laws, and there are no legal issues with using it or processing it. And in short, really, creatine is not an anabolic steroid. They have different chemical structures and are regulated differently and have different method of action within the body. Job done. So the next on the list is, does it cause kidney damage or affect renal function? Now, there is a common concern, one that, to be honest, in the period where I was first using creatine, I wasn't necessarily exposed to it, but the concern was, could the supplement cause kidney damage, similar to the myth that high protein intakes harms the kidneys. Now, despite over 20 years of research showing no harm from recommended doses of creatine, the fear definitely still lingers. This misconception may stem from the lack of understanding about creatine and creatinine metabolism, as well as an old case study from 1998 that linked creatine to kidney problems in a person with pre-existing kidney disease. Now, creatine naturally breaks down into creatinine, which is filtered by the kidneys and excreted in the urine. Increased creatinine levels from creatine supplements or a high meat diet do not necessarily indicate kidney damage. Now, several studies have shown no harmful effects on kidney function from creatine supplements, even when blood creatinine levels temporarily rise. Now, the 1998 case study involved a young man with kidney condition who experienced increased creatinine levels after starting creatine supplements. But this was likely unrelated to his kidney function. Despite this, the idea that creatine harms the kidneys took hold. Since then, many studies have found no link between creatine and kidney damage in healthy individuals. Research has shown that when taken in recommended doses, creatine is safe for the kidneys even after decades of use by athletes and exercisers. The reality with something like creatine is steroids and like testosterone and so on and so forth, you can argue two things when it comes to their danger. One, because there's kind of a barrier to entry as to you don't go on Amazon and just order testosterone. So the pool of people to look at for the side effects is smaller. However, even in that smaller pool of people, you can clearly see that when not done properly, there are risks such as testicular atrophy and things like acne and, mood and things like that. Now, creatine is incredibly prolific. You think all you need to do is go on Amazon and type it in, and there it is. You type it on Google, you've got countless providers of it. You can even go into retail supermarkets and probably find creatine or a protein powder that has creatine in it. And a bit like fast food, where it's incredible how prolific it is, you can see the effects of it on people, the levels of obesity, for example. Whereas creatine, if it were incredibly damaging to the kidneys like this 1998 study suggested, or that it could be, by this point, you would start to see this spike in the trend and a greater level of publications towards its potential damage to renal function and in the kidneys in general. So it's one of those that it looks to be, in the current state we are today, to be a concern that is not necessarily backed up in the research or just in the general population. Maybe you could argue maybe you're ahead of the curve, but it looks to be incredibly low risk, essentially, which is really what we're doing with a lot of these supplements. What's the risk to reward? It's like an investment. If you're investing in something and the potential upside is 5%, but the potential downside is 60%, then it's not a good investment. Whereas creatine is like an investment where the potential upside is, say, 10%, and the potential downside is 1%, maybe, or 0.5%, even less. So the risk to reward ratio is on the positive side. But let's carry on with that risk side and move on to another thing that comes up quite often, and that is creatine and its potential causing of baldness. So this is one that's definitely, I think, more common in men for a concern, because hair loss in general is a concern for men rather than women. But the belief that creatine causes hair loss mainly comes from a single study on male rugby players. Now, this study showed that creatine supplementation increased levels of a hormone called DHT, which is linked to some cases of hair loss. Now, in the study, DHT rose by 56% after a week of creatine loading and stayed at 40% above normal ranges during 2 weeks of maintenance. Now, since DHT is a metabolite of testosterone and can contribute to hair follicle shrinkage in some men, the myth that creatine leads to hair loss gained reasonable popularity. That was definitely something that, when I was initially supplementing with it, was something that it wasn't a concern to me, because the way I looked at it, I thought it was just this kind of like niche area of the internet talking about this. However, the study hasn't been replicated, and no research has shown that creatine directly causes hair loss. Also, intense exercise alone can increase androgen hormones like DHT. Importantly, the DHT levels in creatine group were still within normal limits, and no increase in total testosterone was found. Most studies on creatine and testosterone have shown no significant changes in these hormone levels. So in general, current research does not support the idea that creatine supplementation causes hair loss or increases in DHT or testosterone levels in a way that would lead to baldness. That was a bit as well just worth mentioning, is that a lot of studies, when I was I say studies, okay, this was pre me looking at studies in my life. The whole increasing of testosterone thing came hand in hand with it's not a steroid, however it increases testosterone. If anyone's telling you that, the first is true, the latter isn't. It's neither of those. It's not a steroid, and it doesn't increase testosterone. And then one that was completely novel to me was, does creatine cause dehydration and muscle cramping? Even amongst the cycling and running crowds that I hang around with these days, referring to creatine as causing dehydration wasn't a thing, so I then had to look into it a little bit more just to get a vague kind of overview. But many people think that taking creatine supplements can lead to dehydration and muscle cramping. The idea started in the early 2000s when there were limited research, and the American College of Sports Medicine even suggested that athletes exercising in the hot conditions should avoid creatine supplementation. Now, the reasoning behind this belief is that creatine draws water into muscle cells, which could potentially reduce the water available elsewhere in the body, especially during intense exercise and sweating. Now, leading to cramping or dehydration, which kind of coincides with that whole cramping and dehydration and sodium balance and all this kind of malarkey, which potentially I need to do an episode on itself, because it's a big old discussion, sodium and cramping. And I personally I've only ever experienced a cramp once in my life during exercise, like a serious performance reducing cramp. I've had a muscle starting to really feel like it's being worked, but I've only ever had it once where it, like, my quad began to cramp in my left leg. I was cycling, I got out of the saddle, and it seemed to solve the problem. And I've done 13-hour rides, 16-hour days, or day in particular, and then 8, 9, 10-hour days, plural, where I've used no sodium. And these days I attribute it to potentially a southern Saharan genetics resulting in an improved sodium retention quality and just water retention in general during exercise, and efficiency in cooling and limb length and so on and so forth. But I would be really interested to see what currently the studies actually suggest on sodium supplementation during exercise. But anyway, some surveys showed that athletes using creatine reported muscle cramps or feelings of dehydration. However, these surveys didn't consider other supplements being used or whether the users exceeded the recommended dosage of creatine in general. Now, contrary to these concerns, several studies found no evidence that creatine causes dehydration or cramping. For example, a study of the NCAA football players, those who took creatine experienced significantly fewer muscle cramps and instances of dehydration compared to those who did not take it. Additionally, in the clinical study, patients undergoing a dialysis saw 60% reduction in muscle cramping when given creatine. Now, so in general, the scientific research does not support the idea that creatine supplementation leads to dehydration or muscle cramping, and potentially it's the opposite. But at the very least, taking it is not going to diminish your ability to compete in hot climates. Now, the next one is creatine, and is it harmful for children and adolescents? Many people are concerned about whether creatine supplements are safe for children and teenagers. While there is a lot of evidence showing that creatine is safe for adults, the situation for young individuals is a bit less clear in general. Researchers suggested that creatine could help young athletes improve their performance. A review found that studies on adolescent athletes didn't show any harmful effects from creatine supplementation, but they didn't specifically check health markers to see if any health issues arose. Some studies indicate that creatine may have health benefits for younger people. For example, it has been shown to help children with certain medical conditions like lupus and muscular dystrophy, improving strength and body composition without negatively impacting kidney or liver function. There are also indications that creatine may help with the recovery from traumatic brain injuries, which could be useful for young athletes in contact sports. Importantly, in the late 2020s, the FDA classified creatine as generally recognized as safe. Now, meaning experts agree it is safe for use under recommended conditions. However, this does not include infants and very young children, but it does apply to older kids and teens. Now, in reality, you're not going to be giving this to a baby, are you? Face it. I mean, really, the youngest you're going to see it maybe in your 30s, like your early teens. But really, by the time someone gets into the gym and strength training, in most cases, and then is starting to look at supplementation, they're probably well into the age of like 14, 15, 16, 17, even older. So surveys show that noticeable percentage of young athletes are using creatine. For instance, about 21% of high school boys and 3% of girls reported using it, and as did 12% of elite young athletes in Germany. But in summary, while research is still limited, creatine supplementation appears to be safe and potentially beneficial for children and adolescents. I suppose you could argue you look out for warning signs, but it's one of those that's hard in a sense. Like if you have any suspicions that it could be damaging, I don't know. It's a hard one when it comes to youth, but really, from the point you're 16, for example, there doesn't appear to be any reason why it would be harmful for the individual, because there doesn't seem to be enough difference between someone who's 16 and, say, 18 to warrant there to be an issue that wouldn't be present in older people in general. Now, this next one, I think is definitely correlated with the water retention model, and that is, does it creatine increase fat mass? Some people worry about taking creatine supplements may lead to increased fat mass, especially since some users notice weight gain, which people just associate weight gain a lot of the time, unless you're bulking. But people generally who come into the fitness industry come into it because they want to lose weight, right? That is the preliminary reason they come. They come to lose weight. It's not building muscle really, it's losing weight. And in some cases, especially in women, they're worried about building muscle as if it's this really easy task that they're going to turn into this bulky monster. Or like, not even monster, it's not a really kind word. Just a large, or in their words, a monster, okay? A muscle monster. But it's not that easy. But numerous studies have shown that creatine supplementation does not increase fat mass. In the short-term studies, lasting from 1 week to 2 years, no increase in fat mass was observed in either young or older adults taking creatine. Instead, participants typically saw an increase in lean muscle mass. For example, swimmers who took creatine for 3 weeks did not show any changes in body composition, and active women didn't see any impact on body composition when combining creatine with high-intensity training. Now, even in longer studies, like those lasting 12 weeks or even longer, creatine did not affect fat mass. For instance, older men taking creatine during resistance training also showed no changes in fat mass, and older women increased similarly with their results. Now, interestingly, some studies even reported that creatine supplementation could help reduce fat mass. For example, children with leukemia who took creatine saw significant reductions in fat mass compared to those who didn't use it. Probably a fringe case here, and a sort of recent review of 19 studies involving older adults found that those taking creatine lost a bit more fat mass than those on a placebo group, though the absolute fat mass loss wasn't significantly different. And really, I think the takeaway from it is it's not going to increase fat mass. Maybe because of the increased training stimulus that you're going to induce on yourself because you're training harder, maybe you lose more fat. But generally, taking it, any weight gain you see in the short term, potentially water, long term, probably muscle mass, and it's not going to be fat mass induced from creatine usage. That's it. So what about the loading phase I mentioned earlier? Now, research on creatine supplementation dates back to the early 1900s, right? When studies with animals showed that it could significantly increase levels in muscles. Later studies in the 1980s confirmed that humans could also boost their muscle creatine stores through supplementation, particularly with the method called loading. Now, loading involves taking a higher dose of creatine, 20 to 25 grams a day, divided into smaller doses over 5 to 7 days. After this initial phase, users typically switch to a maintenance dose of 3 to 5 grams per day. A common misconception is that you must load with creatine to see benefits. However, research shows that taking lower daily doses of 3 to 5 grams over a longer period can also effectively increase muscle creatine levels, though it may take a bit longer to reach peak levels. For example, a study found that taking 3 grams a day for 28 days produced similar muscle creatine increases as loading for 6 days at a higher dose. The choice between loading and maintenance strategies depends on the individual goals. If an athlete wants quick results in less than 30 days, loading is the way to go, but those planning to use creatine over a longer period or wish to avoid potential weight gain from loading, a daily maintenance dose is a good option. It's important to take a similar dose during the loading and avoid gastrointestinal issues like diarrhea. Now, really, my stance on this, and what I say to any human being that mentions it to me and asks what I've done in the past or whatever, or is talking about doing a loading phase, I always just ask, how long are you going to take creatine for? And then they go like, I don't know, just indefinitely, like a year. And I'm like, then what does 20 days matter? Like I think it's because people attach it to this monumental strength gain they're going to see from taking creatine. And that's not the case. And even if it was a monumental strength gain, It doesn't matter if it comes in 28 days or in 10 days. If you're going to take it for a year, then it's a blip on the scale of things that you don't need to concern yourself with, essentially. It's going to be way outweighed by the fact that that it's going to be in your system for so long. Even if you're taking it for like 3 months maybe, and then you want to cycle off it, it's still, I don't know whether it's worth it. It's a real headache to remember for the week to just constantly bash this creatine and get it in the system. And the gastrointestinal discomfort depends on the individual. My just digestive system in general is pretty robust. So I have the very, maybe not the first, maybe the second time I used creatine, I loaded it and had no adverse effects. Now, whereas other people I know who are a bit more sensitive to even things like protein, like doing 1 scoop of protein is fine, a double scoop of protein or a 1.5 scoop of protein completely ruins them. Those kind of people, just stay away from loading it. And if you have any concerns in the slightest, just do the 5 grams a day and just do it perpetually. That's really where things are. Yes, loading works. Yes, not loading works. Which one should you do? Well, if you've got a long sight horizon, just do the non-loaded. If you've got a short sight horizon, consider the loading, but understand that gastrointestinal discomfort may be accompanied with the process, essentially. Now, what about for the elderly or just older people in general? Research is increasingly showing that creatine supplementation can indeed be beneficial for various health issues, particularly in older adults facing age-related muscle loss known as sarcopenia. Now, sarcopenia leads to decreased muscle mass, strength, and functionality, increasing the risk of falls, fractures, and end result disability. While resistance training is the primary treatment for the condition, adding creatine may enhance the muscle-building effects of such training, and just in general, like in a young person, it will increase the end result because the training intensity is higher and the volume's higher, so generally beneficial. Now, creatine can help older adults improve strength and maintain muscle mass, especially when used alongside resistance training. However, creatine alone without exercise does not significantly increase muscle strength or mass. Any short-term gains in muscle size from creatine are likely due to water retention, not actually muscle growth. On the other hand, creatine has been shown to enhance the effects of resistance training, helping both young and older adults gain more muscle and strength by boosting workout intensity and volume, as I've said before. Recent studies also show that creatine might benefit bone health in older individuals. For instance, men who over 50 who were supplemented with creatine and engaged in resistance training saw improvements in bone mineral content, and post-menopausal women who experienced a slower rate of bone loss when combining creatine with exercise. That's one thing I thought actually is worth mentioning. For a long time, my assumption was things like running were the epitome of bone density improvements. It turns out that it's the bone response to the shear force, not the impact. So the best way to put it under shear is through weightlifting, essentially. You are contracting the muscle and putting the bone under this shear force and therefore increasing bone mineral density. Now, overall, to achieve the best results, older adults are advised to take creatine alongside resistance training, and it's the same as it would be for a younger individual. Don't just take creatine along with exercise. Now, more research is needed to explore creatine's potential benefits for other conditions that cause muscle or bone loss, as well as its effects on brain health. There is this kind of movement or body of work that's arising now that shows there could be some cognitive improvements and cognitive protective mechanisms. So all things that could potentially, and are, if they are the case, beneficial for elderly people in general. So what about other activities? Is it only strength and power activities that creatine is useful for? Now, while creatine is often thought to mainly help athletes engage in high-intensity power-based activities, recent studies suggest that it can also benefit a wider range of sports and activities where some examples are the improved glycogen storage. Now, creatine, especially when taken with carbohydrates or protein, can enhance muscle glycogen storage, and this is important for recovery and helps athletes maintain energy levels during intense training and competition. And just think, cyclists, glycogen storage, you really need this. Runners, the same, any endurance sports, so potentially it can enhance that. Recovery, creatine may reduce muscle damage and improve recovery after intense exercise. Studies have shown that it can help lead to less muscle soreness and inflammation following through workouts, and helping athletes bounce back from intense sessions quicker, and therefore over the course of, say, a year, the overall volume and intensity is increased. Reduced chance of injuries. Athletes who take creatine may experience fewer musculoskeletal injuries and recover faster if they do get injured, but this might be due to better muscle protection or improved recovery process. In fact, the opposite to what we've said earlier about the dehydration, creatine can help athletes stay hydrated, which is crucial for performance, especially in hot, humid conditions, and may lower the risk of heat-related illness during training and competition. And then the neuroprotective benefits that we've very briefly discussed. Research from animal studies suggests that creatine may protect the brain and spinal cord, potentially reducing the severity of injuries like concussions. And the International Society of Sports and Nutrition even recommends that athletes in high-risk sports consider taking creatine for its protective effects. I used to take it when I was playing rugby. When I moved to cycling, because of the weight situation and the lack of going to the gym, and its benefits clearly being focused on the increased training stimulus that comes from the improved volume and intensity, I ceased to take it. But yes, the information on like neuroprotection wasn't really a thing, but I did take creatine because of the improved training stimulus. But it looks like for rugby players, boxers, so on and so forth, you're probably already taking it because of the improvement in your weight training, or resistance training. But it looks like there are other benefits as well. Now, something I'd only ever heard once, so thought it wasn't really a big concern, but featured in the paper was, does creatine only work in men? Now, research is showing that creatine supplementation may be beneficial for women in various life stages, thanks to differences in how their bodies process creatine. Now, women often have higher levels of creatine in their muscles compared to men, possibly because they typically have less muscle mass in general. Now, this could explain why some studies find that women don't respond as dramatically to creatine as men. One, for the already higher levels, and two, the reduced muscle size in general. Now, female hormones can affect how creatine is produced and used in the body. Changes in hormone levels during the menstruation phase, pregnancy, and menopause can influence creatine levels and availability, suggesting that women might benefit from creatine supplementation during these times. Now, animal studies suggest that creatine supplementation during pregnancy can protect against complications like fatal death and organ damage. While we don't yet have human studies, creatine could help mothers, especially vegetarians or those who can't eat meat, to maintain healthy creatine levels during pregnancy. Women generally have lower creatine levels in the brain, and supplementation may help alleviate symptoms of depression, which is more common in women. In some studies, higher creatine levels in the brain correlated with lower depression symptoms, whereas some studies have shown that younger women can gain muscle mass and strength from creatine supplementation during resistance training. However, results can vary, and not all studies find improved performance. But for older women, creatine supplementation during resistance training has been linked to increased muscle mass and strength and functionality. It may also prevent bone loss when combined with exercise. When it comes to pregnancy in general, I'm always very wary, in the sense that it's a very unique phase, and potentially any contaminants in the supplement, if there are any, potentially on you as a grown individual, have less effect than the unborn child. So it's one of those things to consult with your health professional if you already take creatine, or any supplements for that matter. because you never know. They themselves could have, for whatever reason, they may know of either batch tested forms of the supplement, or be able to provide them through the practice. In the case of things like omegas and stuff like that, creatine less so, but batch tested sources of creatine may be a better avenue to go down, but also just making them aware of any supplements you're taking, because if they're going through the process and they find some abnormality and they don't know you're taking anything, they may not be able to correlate that with a supplement, for example. So it's always worth mentioning and treading with more care when you're in this very unique phase of your life, really. So to finish, are other forms of creatine similar or superior to monohydrate, and is creatine stable in solutions? Now, creatine monohydrate has been extensively researched and is considered the gold standard in creatine supplements. Since the early 1990s, it's been focused of numerous studies that have proven its effectiveness in increasing muscle creatine stores, improving athletic performance, and enhancing muscle growth. Typically, the daily dose, as we said before, 3 to 5 grams of creatine monohydrate raises creatine levels in the bloodstream for several hours, which allows it to be absorbed into the muscle tissue. And over 99% of the creatine taken in is either used by the muscles or excreted in urine, ensuring very little is wasted. Now, other creatine forms of market claims, really. Despite creatine monohydrate's established effectiveness, many companies promote forms of creatine other than monohydrate, like creatine ethyl ester, creatine nitrate, or buffered creatine, as being more efficient, often claiming fewer side effects or better absorption. However, scientific studies do not support these claims. In fact, research shows that these alternative forms of creatine do not increase muscle creatine levels better than creatine monohydrate. In many cases, these forms contain less creatine per gram or are less efficiently absorbed by the body. Additionally, any performance improvements from these products are often due to other ingredients added to the formulation rather than the creatine itself. Now, when it comes to purity and contaminants, creatine monohydrate is produced through various manufacturing processes, with German-made creatine often considered the purest at 99.9% purity. This is because the other strict production standards, which limit contaminants like dicysteranidamide, something like that, and dihydrotesserine, byproducts of creatine chemical reactions that can occur in lower quality creatine production, particularly in some products made in China. These contaminants could potentially pose health risks, so higher quality creatine, especially German sourced, is recommended in general for safety. Now, for creatine stability and solubility, in powder form, creatine monohydrate is very stable and does not degrade over time, even when stored at higher temperatures. However, in liquid form, creatine tends to break down into creatinine, a waste product, especially in acidic environments like in some beverages or when exposed to heat. This is why creatine is mainly sold as a powder and liquid creatine supplements are less effective. Some studies show that creatine's lower water solubility does not affect how well it is absorbed into the body. Even though creatine monohydrate dissolves slowly, once it's ingested, it's effectively taken up by the muscles. And in the past, creatine was sometimes mixed with hot tea to increase solubility, but the practice is now less common as the body absorbs creatine just as well in colder liquids. But in summary, really, alternative forms of creatine might dissolve more easily in fluids or offer marketing claims of superior performance. No scientific evidence supports that they are better than creatine monohydrate, and creatine monohydrate is the most cost-effective, safe, and efficient form, making it preferred choice for athletes and anyone looking to improve muscle performance and growth. Its stability, high absorption rate, and extensive research-backed benefits keep it as the industry standard in creatine supplementation in general. So, yeah, don't bother with any other fancy supplements. Unless, not going to say unless. Maybe, for example, I think Optimum Nutrition have one that is some fancy whatever, and they, at least at the moment, give it out with orders over a certain value. It's not to say don't use that product, but say that product's twice as expensive as one from Bulk Powders that's like just creatine monohydrate. Don't go buying that one in particular. You can just simply get it as for free, and then when you run out and you're no longer getting it as part of a bundle, just go back to normal monohydrate and you'll be perfectly fine. So if you are now thinking that was a lot of information and you forgot most of it, let's just go over things again quickly and feel free to make some notes. So creatine supplementation does not always lead to water retention. Creatine is not an anabolic steroid. Creatine supplementation, when ingested at the recommended dosages, does not result in kidney damage or renal dysfunction in healthy individuals. The majority of available evidence does not support a link between creatine supplementation and hair loss or baldness. Creatine supplementation does not cause dehydration or muscle cramping. Creatine supplementation appears to be generally safe and potentially beneficial for children and adolescents. Creatine supplementation does not increase fat mass. Smaller daily doses of creatine supplementation, like 3 to 5 grams or 0.1 gram per kilogram of body mass, are effective. Therefore, a creatine loading phase is not required to achieve the same benefits. Creatine supplementation and resistance training produces the vast majority of musculoskeletal and performance benefits in older adults. Creatine supplementation alone cannot provide muscle and performance benefits for older adults. Now, creatine supplementation can be beneficial for a variety of athletes and supporting activities. Creatine supplementation provides a variety of benefits for females across their lifespan, and other forms of creatine are not superior to creatine monohydrate. So what are your takeaways from all of this? Feel free to share your opinion with me on Instagram, email, or on the VO2 Lounge Discord server. Links will all be down below. For more content like this, explore my previous works, and don't forget to follow the show to never miss another episode. 5-star reviews are always welcome. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, it's goodbye.